30 years ago, in 1989, most communist governments of Eastern Europe started to reform themselves. Some even fell outright, and in only one country did this initially cause violence and bloodshed, at least outward one, and that was Romania. In East Germany, the longtime hardline communist leader Erich Honecker was dismissed ironically by his colleagues in the Politburo, or the factual East German government, in October 1989, and then Mr. Egon Krenz formed a more reform-minded communist government that decided in early November 1989 to open the 28-year-old Berlin Wall to those East Germans who wanted to visit West Berlin, the democratic and capitalist or social market economy West Berlin. Already earlier that year, since Czechoslovakia had declared itself a passport-free country, or a country through which, for example, East Germans could freely travel west, thousands of East Germans had availed of that opportunity and had moved either to West Germany or some other Western countries. In Poland, partially free parliamentary elections were held, which showed that the Solidarity trade union, which favored democracy, was very popular then. And in August 1989, Mr. Tadeusz Mazowiecki, the politician of that party, was able to form a non-communist government. In Czechoslovakia, the hardline communist leader, Mr. Gustav Husák, had to resign, and the reform-minded communist government then announced that free elections would be held in 1990, as indeed they were, and that then resulted in their defeat. In Hungary, János Kádár, the longtime hardline communist leader, was deposed, and the reform-minded communist government also there announced free parliamentary elections that were then held in 1990. In Yugoslavia, some kinds of reforms had already started back in 1988, and Yugoslavia, which had never had a Soviet-like hardline communist regime, although it had definitely not been a democracy either, and had, for example, contrary to most other communist countries, freely allowed its citizens and other inhabitants to move to other countries and visit other countries. The country was gradually moving towards reforms, although unfortunately that then made the tensions between the country's various nationalities, especially Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Bosniaks, flare up and led to its breakup. In Albania, still, there was little movement towards reform, although the country's communist dictator Ramiz Alia started to see that it would probably be time to relax restrictions. It wasn't until 1991 and 1992 that Albania really started to democratize. In Bulgaria, the longtime hardline communist leader, Mr. Todor Zhivkov, was deposed and replaced by reform-minded communist government. In Bulgaria, however, the first post-communist elections that were totally free and fair did give a majority of seats in the parliament still to the communists' successors, the socialists. But in Romania, that had been ruled for almost 25 years with an iron hand by President Nicolae Ceausescu, who had blended in a curious way communism with patriotism, nationalism, and the Romanian traditional culture, emphasizing his defense of that culture in a sea of Slavs, because on almost all sides Romania is surrounded by Slavic nations. There, unfortunately, violence flared up. It was either in October or probably most likely in November 1989 that a group of expatriate Romanians had sent an open letter to President Ceausescu warning him to start reforms, otherwise others would take the initiative. And this was a code-worded warning: reform or you'll be finished in some way, in one way or another. Also in November, Ceausescu did admit that his government and he himself, or at least the government and the party, Communist Party, had made errors. To put a long story short, around the middle of December 1989, in the western Romanian city of Timișoara, anti-Ceausescu and anti-communist protests started. They spread, although initially they were suppressed, and Hungarian Reformed or Calvinist pastor, Mr. László Tőkés, was temporarily arrested, but later he was freed. Ceausescu visited Iran from December the 18th to 20th, during which time his wife Elena and other leading Romanian communists had to deal with the revolt. On the evening of December the 20th, 1989, fresh from his visit to Iran, Ceausescu then, inside the Romanian Communist Party Central Committee building, spoke against the so-called hooligans who had organized and implemented the demonstrations in Timișoara, and emphasized the need to defend the independence and sovereignty and integrity of Romania. Once again, he tried to blend communism with nationalism and patriotism. He continued on the same themes during a public speech that was supposed to be a pro-Ceausescu demonstration. On the balcony, he spoke from the balcony of the Romanian Communist Party Central Committee building in central Bucharest, the country's capital. However, it turned after only a few minutes to an anti-Ceausescu demonstration. Thousands of people there on that square started to chant anti-Ceausescu slogans. Ceausescu first tried to control the situation by raising one hand, then he made this kind of movement, and he was clearly stunned. Many times he called "Allo" or "hello," and then his wife Elena shouted "Liniște," be quiet, and then he said "Allo, tovarăși, așezați-vă liniștiți la locurile voastre," or "Hello, comrades, stay quietly in your places." Eventually, he was able to gain some partial control of the situation by promising higher minimum wages, higher student allowances, and by claiming to repeating the claim that he was supposedly defending Romania's independence, sovereignty, and territorial or other integrity. And he vowed to fight for communism and socialism in Romania. However, that was an embarrassment to him. That speech can still be seen in some videos on YouTube. And he retreated inside the Central Committee building. Later that day, on the evening, he tried to crack down on those protesters by force, and possibly hundreds, at least tens, if not hundreds of protesters were killed or fatally wounded. He and his wife Elena made a strategic error that possibly even cost them their lives by not fleeing Bucharest under the cover of night. Because that way they could at least have won some time, because not all of Romania was still firmly in the hands of the pro-democracy and anti-Ceausescu demonstrators and activists. Instead, he chose to stay there and tried, in a pitiful way, still speak to the crowds outside the Central Committee building of the Romanian Communist Party on the morning of December the 22nd. That speech was soon drowned out by jeers and boos, and since the guards of that building had left its gates open, the crowd rushed in, and the Ceausescus had to be literally carried into the helicopter by their bodyguards. The helicopter that was only designed to carry 4 people had 6. One of the reasons why it was able to get airborne was that the Ceausescus were so small and thin. So out they went. Their flight was captured by a video camera, but they didn't go far. In northwestern Romania, they then halted. Maybe the helicopter's pilot faked some trouble and basically told the Ceausescus that they were on their own and wished them good luck, perhaps, or probably ironically, even sarcastically. Then the Ceausescus and their 1 or 2 remaining companions flagged cars, and one of them, one motorist, decided to stop his Dacia and gave them a brief car ride, during which Ceausescu, with tears welling up in his eyes, basically said that he couldn't believe that the Romanian people had abandoned him. Then the driver, who didn't wish to be associated with Ceausescu's supporters, faked engine trouble, and the couple were taken to the custody of a local police unit. They were locked up, and then those police officers monitored the situation, and when they saw on the Romanian television that the revolution was in full swing in Bucharest, they decided to keep the Ceausescus locked up. And then finally, during December the 24th, 1989, Christmas Eve, Ceausescu's assistant turned deposer, Mr. Ion Iliescu, decided to have a brief show trial so that the Ceausescus could be executed with at least some tiny semblance of legality. Otherwise, as he said, they could easily have been lynched or beaten to death by the crowd on the streets of Bucharest. And so this short trial that lasted altogether only about 1.5 hours was held in the military garrison of Târgoviște in northwestern Romania. Repeatedly during the trial, the deposed President Ceausescu claimed that he supposedly was still the Romanian president, and he once even said, "I'm the Romanian president and the Romanian Armed Forces commander. No one can deprive me of these functions." Repeatedly he said, "Nu recunosc tribunalul." I don't recognize the court. "Nu recunosc niciun tribunal in afară de Marea Adunare Națională." Or, I do not recognize any court outside or except for the Grand National Assembly, which was the Romanian Communist Party parliament's official name. When he was told that the Grand National Assembly had been dissolved, he refused, at least according to his statements, to believe it, claiming that no one supposedly could dissolve the Grand National Assembly. He refused, since he refused to recognize the court's legality, he refused to admit the fact that throughout the 1980s the ordinary Romanians' living standards had plummeted. But this, well, he had an excuse which he didn't mention. He wanted to repay the country's huge foreign debt, because as a part of his semi-independent political foreign policy course, he had pleased enough Western countries to get huge loans in order to develop the country's heavy industries, and then he wanted to pay off that debt, and he managed by sometime in the summer of 1989, so just some months before the revolution, to do that. But it meant increasing hardships for many millions of ordinary Romanians. His dream of having a nation of 30 million meant that abortions were made almost impossible to get, and the Romanian mothers who gave birth to multiple babies were honored lavishly. But it meant also that many Romanian children were simply abandoned and sent off to orphanages. To put a long story short, the admittedly kangaroo court, hastily assembled temporary court, found Nicolae Ceausescu and Elena Ceausescu guilty of oppressing the Romanian people, violating the country's constitution, destroying the country's economy, which was not totally true, since the national debt had been officially eliminated, and then of genocide through starvation and cold, and then executions and so forth. They also claimed, the court also claimed, that the Ceausescus would secretly have hidden much wealth in foreign bank accounts, but no such bank accounts have been found. And while it was true that executions did take place from time to time, the accusation of genocide has not at least fully been proved to date. And indeed, in the revolution of late December 1989, thousands of Romanians were killed. Anyway, at first, the court decided that the Ceausescus would be separately taken by some soldiers to the military garrison's courtyard and shot separately. Defiantly, Mrs. Elena Ceausescu, who was a scam, a fake physicist, even though during her elementary school years she had only received good grades in one subject, needlework, and probably she didn't know even elementary physics, let alone deserve any of the titles, including one honorary doctorate that were granted to her. That probably she paid or ordered the payment of money to qualified scientists to write those papers, ones who wanted to please her. She defied the court, declaring strictly or sternly, "If you want to kill us both together, împreună, împreună," she kept repeating. And then 4 soldiers came to tie the couple's hands behind their backs, which of course was technically unnecessary, since they were old, physically weak, and short. There was no way, and they were unarmed, there was no way they could have escaped execution. They could have, of course, tried to run away, but then they could have been simply shot summarily on their backs. Mrs. Ceausescu kept protesting as her hands were tied behind her back, claiming, even calling the soldier who tied her hands behind her back child, and said, "Child, do not do this to me. Stop it, you are breaking my arms. I have raised you as a mother." And one soldier replied, "Half of our colleagues are dead because of you." And then, during her final moments before being taken to the courtyard, Mrs. Ceausescu even said, "They are of the Securitate, that notorious secret police, a brutal secret police of communist Romania, not of us. Here we are. What power do we have anymore? You have it. Ask those who have power." The deposed President Ceausescu gave up his resistance earlier than his wife and told her to relax and let be, as his hands were tied behind his back. When they were being led into one of the walls of the military garrison's courtyard in the frigid or cold December air, Mr. Ceausescu sang some verses of the International Workers' March, while Mrs. Ceausescu at least once shouted obscenities to the soldiers who were leading her and her husband to the wall. And then once they reached the wall, they turned to face their executioners. The soldiers retreated so that they would not be hit by the hail of bullets. And one of the soldiers, Colonel Ion, I try to find out his name. he believes that he was the one whose bullets actually, Ionel Boeru, Mr. Ionel Boeru, who was paratrooper, he believes that his bullets were the ones that killed the Ceausescus. And while there were two or three other Romanian soldiers, and there reportedly were hundreds who had volunteered, his first hail of bullets hit Mr. Ceausescu in the knees. He dropped to his knees, and then the second one hit Mr. Ceausescu in the chest, killing him. And then the second hail of bullets, or round of bullets, killed Mrs. Ceausescu. And their dead bodies were then shown on a close-up on that video camera to prove that they were dead. A medical doctor, maybe the same medical doctor who had examined the Ceausescus, or at least Mr. Ceausescu, to make sure that he was medically fit to stand trial, pronounced them dead at the scene. They were then buried 5 days later on December the 30th, 1989, in a cemetery in Bucharest. In 2010, their bodies were exhumed to prove that they were indeed those of the Ceausescus, and that was proven. Romania formed the so-called National Salvation Front, which was largely composed of former communist officials and politicians, and it was able to win 2 consecutive parliamentary elections in 1990 and 1992, but more liberal forces then won in 1996. Romania remains today a fairly turbulent country politically, and has had many changes of government since the fall of communism, and since also the defeat of former President Iliescu, but is a democracy in any case, and has since 2007, along with its southern neighbor Bulgaria, belonged to the European Union.